So in this section, I want to introduce you to a minor puzzle about habitual action, which I hope will deepen our understanding of the dual process theory of action. In this part of the course, we're concerned with individual agents, and as background to a question, the problem of action, what distinguishes actions from things that merely happen to you, we're interested in the question, what kind of processes in individual agents guide their actions? Now, in thinking about this question, the key thing that we have done so far is to distinguish two kinds of guiding process. One, habitual, the other, goal-directed. The habitual processes are characterized by Thorndike's law of effect. There is a stimulus which is associated with an action. The strength of that association in you depends on how rewarding it has been in the past to perform the action in that situation. The more rewarding, the stronger the stimulus-action connection, and therefore the more likely that you will perform the action now, according to the habitual process. Very slight simplification there. Will come some complications later in the course perhaps. On the other hand, with the goal-directed process, the guidance involves something like a belief about how likely performing this action in this situation is to result in this outcome, together with a preference for that outcome versus other outcomes. Right? So when we've got the goal-directed processes, we're thinking about something that looks much more like a kind of belief, desire, intention kind of rationalization. That's the idea. All right. So we've got a distinction between those two kinds of processes. So naively, you might think, well, let's just start classifying some of our actions. So this morning I did my teeth. I didn't smoke any tobacco because I'm very good. Don't do that anymore, very naughty. I may have watched some TV last night, and then you might think, well, look, which of those actions are habitual? Which of those actions are habitual? And I actually want you to think about this question. So if I were doing this lecture live, you see this circle and you'd know that I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and talk about this question for about 90 seconds. And I'm going to walk around the room, and if you're not talking, I'm going to talk to you. So you really want to talk to someone. Now, of course, with the online lectures, there's no way that I can say, go, and you're going to do that. But what I'm hoping is that you might be watching these lectures with somebody or able to communicate about them simultaneously with other people, in which case I want you to pause the video and have a discussion at the points where these circles come. And if that's not you, if you're the person who refuses to talk to other people about these things, I would still like you to stop and have a think, pause the video. So I'm not going to actually do the 90-second pauses in the recordings, but when you see the circle, I want you to stop and pause and have a think. There's a reason for this. In this section, and in some of the other sections on this course, I'm not really lecturing in a sense. I'm trying to give you some pointers and get you to do some thinking about these issues. Right? That thinking is going to be an integral part of the learning process, all being well. Good. All right, so just pause the video, have a think about this question. Which of these actions are habitual? What's paradigm habitual action and what isn't? Welcome back. Good. Thank you for doing that. Very good. Now, the first thing we've got to be careful about here is that we're using the term habitual in a special technical sense, quite different from what you might find in a dictionary. So I had a quick look in a dictionary. I'm lazy, so I just used the first thing I could find on the internet. Thank you, DuckDuckGo. And the dictionary I found says a habitual action, state or way of believing, is one that someone usually does or has, especially one that's considered to be typical or characteristic of them. Now, it's very important that for this course, you do not think that this is the case, right? Okay, nothing wrong with the dictionary, but that's not what we mean by habitual. That's not what we mean by habitual. What we mean by habitual is a process that's governed by Thorndike's law of effect, right? That's governed by those stimulus-action associations. And that's quite different from this definition. If you make that confusion, you will fail. If you make that confusion, you will fail, right? You really have to keep these two things separate. Very important. All right, good. Here you remember this from a previous section. I won't give you the recap now, but this is how we characterize the habitual processes. The stimulus-action link is strengthened by the stimulus and action co-occurring with a reward that the agent receives. So it turns out that when we go back to these actions and say, gosh, which of those are habitual, it's going to be quite difficult to answer that question. It's going to be quite difficult to answer that question because it's really hard to understand what kind of processes are involved in them. And it's not like in these everyday activities that we've got a kind of great deal of control. We couldn't really hope very much for some repeatable observations. So what we need to do is to strip the situation down and enter the laboratory. So here's our friend the rat, and the rat has the following deal. It's placed in a room with a lever, right? And rats are kind of curious, so if you place a rat in a room with a lever, now and again it's going to run up and press the lever. Ooh, what's happening here? I'm curious, right? I'm curious rat. And what we're doing is something called instrumental conditioning. So actually what we're doing here is that every time the rat presses a lever, a novel food will be dispensed, sugary pellet that the rat, with a flavour the rat has never had before, and this food will be awarded to the rat, right? Be dispensed to the rat. So after a while, the rat's like, "Whoa, great! I love this lever, right? Best thing ever." The question is the rat in pressing the lever performing a habitual action? Right? Is that what's going on? And actually, this is one of those cases where I'd just like you to pause the video, stop, and think about it. You done that? Thank you very much. Okay, good. So if we're going to say that the process is habitual, then let's try and work out, sorry, step back, Steve. If we want to answer this question, is the lever pressing a habitual action? What we need to do is to first of all consider the hypothesis that the action is explained by habitual processes, and then consider the hypothesis that it's explained by goal-directed processes, and see whether we can generate distinctive predictions. So start with the habitual process. We need a stimulus. So in this case, I'm just going to say the stimulus is the layout of the room. Now exactly what the stimulus is, it's going to be quite difficult to work out here, but we won't go far wrong if we just assume that it's the layout of the room with the lever in it. We also need a reward, and in this case the reward is the food, and of course the rat is the agent in question. So we're just filling in our definition of habitual processes with some details here. The stimulus action link links of course the room to the lever press. The lever press is the action that we're interested here, and that link is strengthened due to the food reward. Right? That's good, we have got a case of conditioning here. So what we would predict is that the lever press should happen in this room. Right. Why are we predicting that? Well, on the hypothesis that the process governing the action is habitual, we have a strong association between the stimulus, the room, and the action, the lever press, because that combination has been well rewarded in the past. Now consider the second hypothesis. The action in question is guided by a goal-directed process. All right, what do we predict here? Well, let's fill in the details. So the lever pressing is the action that leads to some outcome, in this case the dispensing of the tasty food. The lever press and the link between the lever press and the food, the action and outcome link, that's a strong old link. And the agent in question, the rat here, has a strong positive preference for this food. And that you can take for granted. The food was chosen precisely so that it would appeal to rats who'd never had it before. And so once again we're predicting that the lever press will occur, the action will occur here. Now you might notice that there's something gone wrong here. The thing that's gone wrong here is that we've got two different hypotheses. Hypothesis that the action is guided by habitual processes, hypothesis that it's guided by goal-directed processes, but both make the same prediction. So actually there's no way to distinguish these two hypotheses. This is a very important fact. You cannot look at a behaviour and think, oh, I bet that's habitual, I bet that's goal-directed, right? That is not going to work, because in many, many cases, like this one, the hypothesis that the action is guided by habitual processes will make the same predictions as the hypothesis that it's guided by goal-directed processes. This is why it's so important that we're in the lab where we can exercise a strong measure of control and repeat the operation in just the same way across multiple different agents, allowing us to gather some evidence. What we need then is a way to change the situation so that the two hypotheses make different predictions. How are we going to do that? Well, what if we devalue the food? Steve, what is devaluation? Steve, that is a great question. I'm so glad you asked. Devaluation just means intervening in a way that should reduce the preference that a rat has for the food. Right? So typically this will be done by, for example, in the presence of a novel food, giving the rat a mildly toxic injection to make it sick. And in this situation, the rat will then very likely become averse to the food, right? Just as you had. Suppose that you had watermelon, to use Tony Dickinson's example. You had some watermelon for the first time, and then you drank too much beer and became mildly ill. The next morning you go out and you think to yourself, I'd love some of that watermelon, because it would be just the right thing for my hangover. But you go up to the watermelon, and you look at it and you're just about to bite it. You catch the smell and you go, oh, I can't eat that, that's disgusting. And for the rest of your life, you're averse to watermelon. You never want watermelon again. What's happened here is that the watermelon has been devalued for you. The watermelon has been associated with illness, and that association has caused aversion in you, and now you becoming aware of that adverse response means that you no longer want the watermelon. So this is one way of devaluation. Now what Dickinson and colleagues did with his rats is exactly this. First of all, the novel food, it wasn't watermelon, it was a kind of flavoured sugar pellet, a sucrose pellet, and then they provide the rat with a minor illness, like your hangover, and then the rat re-encounters the food and goes, oh, you know, disgusting, bodily reactions, aversion, and now the food is devalued. The rat no longer likes it. There are other ways to devalue the food, so you can also be quite mean and give the rat little electric shocks in connection with the food, so it becomes associated with something mildly painful. And because we do this with humans, and you're not really allowed these days to shock or poison humans, you might devalue the food by allowing the rat or the human to become sated on it, right? So if there's something really delicious, no matter how delicious it is, eventually you'll become sated and no longer want to eat that thing. So even chocolate, you can become sated on chocolate. So I've heard anyway. So devaluation, very simple. What we're going to do is take what the rat formerly enjoyed and devalue it for the rat, poor thing. When we do that, we're going to make different predictions about what happens. You see, if the behaviour is guided by a goal-directed process, then the rat's current preference should determine whether or not the rat presses the lever. This is the essence of the goal-directed process idea. How much you like the thing now is going to determine whether or not you perform the action that brings that about. Since the rat no longer likes the food, what we're going to predict here is that the rat will stop pressing the lever. That's our prediction on the hypothesis that the behaviour is guided by a goal-directed process. How about when the behaviour is guided by a habitual process? Well, in this case, what's supposed to trigger the behaviour is the strength of the connection between the stimulus and the action, between the room and the lever press. But in devaluing the food, we haven't changed the strength of that connection yet. We have not changed the strength of that connection yet. So what we should predict on the hypothesis that the rat's behaviour is guided by the habitual process is that the lever pressing will occur much as before. Now, of course, what will happen in the future is that the rat will no longer find the food rewarding, and so it could well be that the strength of the connection between the room and the lever press is reduced over some period of time, right? But we would not expect it to be reduced immediately. At most, what we're going to expect on the habitual process hypothesis is that the rat will only very gradually stop pressing the lever and not abruptly. So at this point, you should understand what devaluation is. What we're predicting follows from devaluation on the hypothesis that the action is guided by the habitual process, and what follows on the hypothesis that the action is guided on the goal-directed process. We've got different predictions. And just to be sure, this is a really good point for you to turn to the person that you are watching these sections with and just have a little discussion. What is the expected prediction on the goal-directed process? What's the expected prediction on the habitual process? Take a moment, give me a pause, I'll see you in a sec. Oh, you're back. Fantastic. So hopefully you've got this absolutely straight. The goal-directed process hypothesis predicts that we're going to get a vast reduction in lever pressing, pretty much to none following devaluation. The preference isn't there. The hypothesis that the action is guided by the habitual process tells us that this is going to have no effect on lever pressing at all, initially at least, the devaluation. What do we observe? Well, this is slightly complicated because what I haven't told you yet is how we can control for the rat's behaviour. What we're trying to do is to see a change in the rat's behaviour. But if we just have one group of rats, it wouldn't be very surprising if we got a lower lever pressing action, because after all, you know, we've made the poor things a little bit ill, so they might just be like less inclined to cooperate with us after all, right? They're just being much less friendly rats. So what we actually need are two groups of rats here. And the deal is this. One group of rats has been trained to press the lever in response to a particular food, but they've also, I didn't tell you this before, they've been given a second type of novel food. And the type of food associated with the lever press has now been devalued. That's this first group of rats. Second group of rats has had the opposite experience. So they've been trained with a different food on the lever pressing to the one that was devalued. So these rats in the second group have suffered the same illness, but that illness for them is associated with a distinct novel food. See how clever that is? Tony Dickinson is an absolute genius. Really careful experiments. I'm going slowly over this one, by the way, because it's going to be foundational for a series of further things that we're going to do later. So it's well worth being sure that you understand this thing, even though we're taking our time here and going nice and slowly. So what you can see here is something very simple. The lever presses per minute following devaluation is much lower where the food associated with the lever has been devalued compared to a different group of rats where another food has been devalued. So they've all been ill, this experiment is beautifully controlled, but these rats are pressing the lever much more often because the food that's associated with the lever and being delivered by the lever hasn't been devalued for those rats. Now take a look at this a second way. This is also very nice. Sorry, I should say as well, it's very important. In this case, the process is extinction. So what's happening here is that nothing is being provided when the rats press the lever. So there's no further learning opportunity that the rats have at this point. That's why this is the extinction part of the experiment. So what's happening here when I'm pressing the lever is nothing. I'm not getting a chance to reacquire the food. So of course you would expect both groups of rats to be pressing the lever a bit less, but this group of rats here doesn't like the food, whereas this group of rats does like the food. And the group of rats that does like the food is pressing the lever a bit more than the rats that doesn't, even though from their point of view the lever's broken, the food isn't being dispensed anymore. Anyway, now we go to the reacquisition phase. So now we're adding back to lever presses the food that was provided to them before. And what you can see here is that if anything, right, this puts off the group of rats that suffered devaluation of that food. By contrast, the group of rats that have not had that food devalued, they're pretty excited and they're pressing the lever more and more as these trials go on. By the fourth trial, they're pressing the lever really quite rapidly per minute. By contrast, if we do something a bit different, and we now rig up the lever so that it dispenses the food that for the first group of rats was not devalued, but was devalued for the second group of rats, we get the opposite pattern in reacquisition. So this group of rats now is really friends with the lever. They want to press that lever, right? Previously the lever created some food that they now really don't want at all. But the new situation is the food provided by the lever is kind of something they do like. And you can see that they're learning to press that lever really pretty rapidly. Whereas the group for which this food was devalued, now they're pressing the lever a lot less. Okay, good. So here are the key results from Dickinson's experiment, the devaluation experiment that was designed to answer the question, is the rat's lever pressing guided by habitual processes or by goal-directed processes? So you remember that those two hypotheses made different predictions. The goal-directed hypothesis predicts no lever pressing and the habitual process predicts lever pressing. And it looks like this hypothesis has won. As Dickinson himself puts it, the laboratory rat fits the goal-directed model. Performance of this particular instrumental behaviour, the lever pressing, really does seem to be controlled by knowledge about the relation between the action and the goal. And this is exciting for us because you might think, look, you know, rats are kind of simple creatures. I don't want to go about saying that rats have beliefs and desires. But this experiment pushes us in that direction. It pushes us to the thought that, you know, perhaps what rats have is something very much like what humans have in terms of their practical reasoning. Now, of course, there are still various ways where you might want to distinguish rats and humans. We might want to explore that. What this experiment is challenging us to do is not make simple assumptions about rats' thinking and actions. Looks like they're moderately sophisticated, at least by the standards of humans. But there's a catch, right? Maybe you've already seen this catch. The hypothesis that the action is guided by the goal-directed process predicts that the lever pressing should be reduced to none. But the lever pressing is not reduced to none, right? In the extinction phase here, you can see that they're pressing it twice a minute. Why is there that residual pressing of the lever? Why are they still pressing the lever in the extinction phase? And this is the minor puzzle of my title. If the action is not habitual but controlled by a goal-directed process, why does it still occur after devaluation? If, on the other hand, the action is habitual, why would it be influenced by devaluation at all? Right? So you can see why this is a puzzle. Neither of these ideas seems satisfactory. Neither of the hypotheses, as I've presented them, is properly supported by the findings. So how are we going to resolve this puzzle? Well, guest, I want you to turn to the person that you're enjoying this recording with or communicating with about it, and just spend about 90 seconds having a quick go with them. Perhaps you can already solve the puzzle, or perhaps there's something that you need to clarify. Go. Excellent, well done. So, welcome back. The key, I think, here is that we are mistaken to think that it's the actions which are either habitual or goal-directed. What we've done is characterised processes as habitual or goal-directed. That's what we've actually characterised, and if you look in the lecture notes, you'll see that everything is carefully framed in those ways in the glossary and in the previous sections, for example. But somehow here we've illicitly jumped to the idea that the action, not just the processes that guide it, but also the actions themselves, must be either habitual or goal-directed. And that, of course, is our mistake. That's where we have come unstuck in a spectacular way. Let's see what Dickinson says. Dickinson says, looking back now, he says, "We did not conclude that all such responding was guided by goal-directed processes only. Indeed," says Dickinson, "we observed some residual responding during the post-revaluation test that appeared to be impervious to outcome devaluation and therefore autonomous of the rat's current preference." Excellent. So I think what Dickinson is after here fits perfectly with the dual process theory of action. The dual process theory of action says that instrumental actions are controlled by two dissociable processes, a goal-directed and a habitual process. And the crucial thing to see here is that it's consistent with the dual process theory of action to suppose that both processes are guiding an action simultaneously. Both processes will influence it. Now, of course, they may be pulling in different directions, in which case we would expect that one will dominate and the other will have to, in some way, give way. Much more about that later when we come to discuss interface problems. But for now, we're interested in cases where, as with the lever pressing, the habitual and goal-directed processes are both pulling potentially in the same direction initially. So here's the dual process theory. We have an instrumental action, and we're interested in the processes that are behind it. We're saying that the instrumental action can be influenced by two kinds of process, one that goal-directed and one habitual. But we're not saying that sometimes one of these is at work and sometimes the other is at work. What the theory is telling us is that for any action, it's very likely that both processes will be influential to some degree or other. Both processes will be operating and both processes will be pulling along. Not that they'll always be pulling with the same strength, but they'll both be pulling along. Furthermore, some factors, like the strength of preferences, will have a strong effect on one process and only a weak effect on another process. And this is why devaluation is so important to us. Devaluation is an intervention on the strength of the rat's preferences for the novel food. We would expect that intervening on this variable, the strength of the preferences, will have a big effect on the goal-directed processes and a small effect on the habitual processes. That's why we predict that if the goal-directed process is important for the action, intervening on the preferences will have a direct effect on the instrumental action itself, whereas on the habitual hypothesis, we don't get the same prediction. But of course, the dual process theory recognises that there are many other factors, like the strength of the stimulus-action link, which go the other way. Changing this will make a big difference to what the habitual process does, but should have a small effect, if any, on the goal-directed process. And so on for many other factors. There'll be many factors here, most of which will differentially affect the two kinds of process. This then is our dual process theory of action. You have a single instrumental action, the pressing of a lever, for example, and you expect that on the whole, at least two kinds, perhaps more, but at least two kinds of process will be influential. And we can work out the relative strength of the different processes' influence by manipulating factors performing interventions that should, according to the theory, differentially affect the goal-directed and the habitual process. Very nice. So where are we in conclusion? The question was whether the lever pressing is a habitual action, and the suggestion I'm making to you is that that's a bad question to ask. It's a bad question to ask, but there's an interesting reason why it's a bad question. The interesting reason is that the dual process theory tells you that both processes are there. So for the most part, we can't easily characterize an action either as habitual or as a goal-directed action. Most actions are going to involve elements of both. What we can ask is whether the action is a consequence of habitual or goal-directed processes, and the answer in this case is probably both, right? In this case, what we've seen is that both processes are at work. And in the next section, when we look at some evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action, we're going to find that the same is true of some human actions as well. My actions and your actions are probably partly but not exclusively a consequence of habitual processes, and partly but not exclusively a consequence of goal-directed processes.